here? Is Dr. Murthy here? That's the question.
Yes, I'm here as well. Hi, Kim. How are you?
I'm well. How are you?
It's good to see you again.
Lovely to see you too. Okay, let's crack on then, because we don't have huge amounts of time. So I'll start, Robert, if that's all right. I'll do a little bit of an introduction about my loneliness journey and the work that I've been lucky enough to be involved with on the issue of loneliness over the last few years. And then the most important bit, I will speak to Vivek about his vast amount of experience and the work that he's done on loneliness. So it's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me, Robin, and the wonderful campaign to end loneliness. And it's great to see so many people on the conference today. It shows that there still is a really big appetite to talk about this subject and to try and address some of the issues around loneliness. I'm here today, as Robin said, as a Member of Parliament for Batley and Spen in West Yorkshire. I also am here as the co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on loneliness and connected communities. So I think that's the other important thing to say is we talk about loneliness a lot. And I think someone else just mentioned it in the previous session, we need to talk about human connection. And I think having that broad conversation is really important. The theme today is something I feel really passionately about. Given what we've been through in the past few years, we do need a new era of connection to tackle loneliness. It's an absolute honour to be sharing the screen with the wonderful Dr. Murthy, who I've got huge amounts of admiration and respect for, and I'm looking forward to speaking to him in a second. But I think the other thing to say from my perspective is I'm talking about this issue now as an MP, but this is a subject that I feel passionately about on a personal level, because this is a political issue, I believe, but it's also a very personal issue to every single person in a different way. Some of you will know that in June of 2016, my life changed forever when my sister, Jo Cox, who was the MP for Batley and Spen, was murdered. And she was going about her duties as the MP in the streets up here in West Yorkshire, where I am today, where I live. And since Jo was killed, I've been extremely lucky to be surrounded by amazing people who have scooped me up and scooped my family up and looked after us in lots of ways. And a lot of that has been about community, and it's been about really important human connection. And part of the work that we did after Jo was killed was continuing the work that she'd started on a wide variety of subjects, but loneliness was at the heart of that. And it was an issue that Jo felt passionately about. We reflect a lot, and this is an area of expertise for people on the call much more so than me, but how communities have changed and how our opportunities for human connection are not there in the same way that they used to be. So we always used to talk about when we were little, and my granddad would go around the town centre and he knew everybody and he chatted to everybody, and we don't have some of that in the same way in some towns and cities and that we used to have when we were younger. So Jo set up the Jo Cox Commission on Loneliness, and she worked on a cross-party basis, something Jo felt passionately about, something I feel passionately about. Some things transcend party politics, and it's really important that on issues, particularly of a human nature, we work together across the political divide. So she worked with Rachel, she worked with Seema Kennedy, and then after Jo was killed, Rachel Reeves, who is now our Shadow Chancellor, picked up that work and worked with Seema Kennedy on a cross-party basis. And condensing a lot of hard work into a short sentence, we ended up, as a result of that work, with the world's first ever Minister for Loneliness in the wonderful Tracy Crouch, who is now my Conservative co-chair on the all-party parliamentary group, and the world's first ever government strategy on loneliness. So it was a fantastic piece of work, and it really was a change in time on this important issue, supported very much by Theresa May, who was the then Prime Minister. Really good example of how politics, despite all the trauma and divisions it does entail, can sometimes be used as a real force for good. So a lot of the work that I did in those early years after Jo was killed was at a local level in the community. And I saw the power of bringing people together in the face of tragedy to connect on a human level and tackle lots of different issues, but loneliness was definitely one of them. And as Robin has said, through the Jo Cox Foundation, we set up the Great Get Together campaign, where we encourage people to come together in their communities, make connections and address lots of different issues, you know, around cohesion and around lots of things, but particularly loneliness at the heart of it. And I have to say, in that time when I was working for the Jo Cox Foundation, wherever I went in the country and indeed the world, the one issue everybody mentioned to me was loneliness. and it amazed me. I went to speak at a conference in Italy. I met with Vivek down in London, and you know, so people from across the world knew that this was an issue. And the good thing is, we started to do something about it, and we've come a long way since then. I guess the thing for now is, where do we go from here? We've had a bit of a setback with COVID and the pandemic, and the important thing now is turbocharging that action over the coming years. My job now in Parliament is to do that through the All-Party Parliamentary Group, and to make sure that the government does not take its eye off the ball on this really important issue. So, enough of my story, but hopefully that gives you an explanation as to why I'm here sharing today with you. Let me speak to Vivek. So, Vivek, lovely to see you again. Hello.
So good to see you as well. And I remember that meeting we had in 2018, like it was yesterday. It was a big, it was a big moment for me, because I've been inspired by your sister and by the legacy of her work and everything she did, not just for folks in the UK, but the inspiration she provided to people around the world to take on this issue. And I would just say that the attention that you and so many other leaders in the UK have paid to the issue of loneliness, including, of course, the campaign to end loneliness, have really been an inspiration for the world. I mean, you showed not only through, you know, Tracy Crouch's appointment, but through other initiatives that you built and the strategy you put out, that this is a legitimate issue, and it's an important issue, and it's one that should be prioritized, you know, on a national and international stage. So I just want to recognize and thank you for all of your leadership on this important issue. I'm grateful to be having this conversation.
Well, that is extremely kind of you. I mean, what I would say is, it's a massive team effort, and we've got amazing organisations in the UK and around the world who've been doing this work for a lot longer than I have. And organisations like the Red Cross, you know, who are the Secretariat for the APPG now, and organisations like Robin's, the Campaign to End Loneliness, you know, they have been doing this stuff for a long time. But you're right, it's important that those people who have got a profile are able to use that profile to raise the importance of this issue. So can I ask you a few questions then?
Yes.
So what first interested you in this issue around loneliness and social isolation?
You know, it's interesting for, I think, a lot of us who care about the topic of loneliness and social connection. We've had a personal experience or personal experiences that have brought us to the space. I know that, you know, has been the case for you in your life as well, as you so eloquently shared. You know, in my case, I did struggle a lot with loneliness as a child. You know, I still remember going to school, being dropped off by my mother each day and feeling this pit in my stomach because I was scared. And I wasn't scared about tests or teachers. I was scared about feeling alone, because as a, you know, very shy, introverted child, I wanted to make friends, but it was a little tougher for me to do so. And I still remember the scariest part of the day was lunchtime, walking into the cafeteria as a child and not knowing if there would be somebody to sit next to. And it was only really in many years later that I realized that I wasn't the only one feeling that way. But I was ashamed of it as a child. And that sense of shame is something that people carry who struggle with loneliness, especially children. And I never talked to anyone about it during that time, including my parents, even though I knew that they loved me unconditionally. So those are my earliest experiences of loneliness, and certainly have experienced it even at times as an adult. Then later in life, I started to see it in my patients that I was caring for as a doctor. You know, no one ever taught me about loneliness in medical school. It wasn't part of the curriculum. Yet I found so often when people were coming in with infections or blood clots, or, you know, for heart attacks or other medical conditions, and I would have conversations with them, I would find out they were actually struggling with loneliness, that, you know, and it was incredibly common. But it was finally when I became Surgeon General during President Obama's administration, and I started traveling the country, talking to people about how I could be helpful, trying to understand what they needed. That is where it really struck me that loneliness was more than something that was isolated to my own life and experience and work. It was something that was affecting people all across America, and it turns out around the world. And no one ever came to me and said, "Hi, my name's Vivek, my name's Kim, I'm lonely." People didn't say that, but they would say it in different ways. They would say, you know, I just feel like there's so much to deal with in the world, but I've got to carry all those burdens by myself. Or I feel if I disappear tomorrow, nobody would even care. Or if you walk around feeling invisible. And this is people all across the age spectrum who were telling me this, including young students at university who were surrounded by hundreds of other people, and who really helped prove the point that loneliness is not about the number of people around you. It's about the quality of your connections. It's about feeling seen and understood and heard, feeling valued, being able to be vulnerable with other people. And many of them didn't feel they had that. So finally, it's when I dug into the actual data and science around this, inspired by those conversations I had with people, across the country and the world, that's when I started realizing this is one, incredibly common, but it's also extraordinarily consequential for our mental and physical health, as loneliness raises the risk and increases the likelihood of anxiety and depression, but also increases the risk of premature death and heart disease and dementia. And that's why I often find it striking when people look at the data, they're surprised to know that the mortality impact associated with smoking is in fact similar. I mean, with loneliness is in fact similar to the mortality impact of smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And it's greater than the mortality impact with obesity or with substance use. And so, I think about as a public health official, how much time we've historically in public health spent on smoking, on obesity, on substance use disorders, and how relatively little time we have spent on issues like social connection and loneliness. But the data increasingly tell us that this warrants being a priority for individuals and for society at large. So that's why, I'm focused on it. And certainly during this time that, I have an opportunity to serve the public, in government again, I want to make this issue a priority. And we are planning a broader initiative on rebuilding social connection and community that we hope to launch soon.
Brilliant. Goodness me, so many amazing points there. I think just to pick up on a few, I think you're absolutely right. I think this acknowledgement that loneliness can happen to anybody at any time in their lives and across the lifespan. And there are worrying statistics around children and young people who feel lonely. I think it's absolutely right. And I think you're right about when you've had personal experience, obviously it connects you very deeply to an issue, doesn't it? I mean, for us, for Jo and for myself, and you touched on this, it was when Jo went to university that she felt particularly lonely. We'd been incredibly close as children and we did everything together, whether it was going out on our bikes or going to dancing or whatever it was. And then suddenly we were apart. And she was away at university down at Cambridge University, very different from where we were brought up in Yorkshire. Before we had mobile phones and emails and things, and she found herself feeling very isolated and lonely. Equally, I'd lost my big sister. I was up in Yorkshire and I really struggled. So I think you're right. I think we've got to look at this very holistically through the lifespan, children, young people, university students, and then going into adulthood and the rest of our lives as well. And you're right, the other thing that Jo had observed was when she was campaigning to be the Member of Parliament, she would knock on people's doors and people really wanted to chat. Now, they didn't want to chat about politics, surprisingly. They wanted to chat about anything because they just wanted to have that human connection and that contact. And her knocking on that door could have been the only person they've spoken to all day. And the point you made about doctors, I mean, the research around GPs, the number of appointments that are taken up every day by people who, again, just want some human connection. And there might be a small medical issue that they're worried about, or they might not be, but it's that human connection that's really important. So yeah, absolutely fantastic answers. Thank you so much. So what would you say the impact is that you've seen on people in your personal and professional lives around sort of the impact of loneliness, but also maybe the impact of the work that you've done on loneliness?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think so. A few things. I think number one, I think there's a growing awareness and I think appreciation for how common loneliness is and for the impact this has on our health and well-being. I still think that there's a lot more awareness to build. There's still too often people think, this is just a bad feeling, something people have to suck up and deal with, and don't fully realize, the consequences of it. Like we don't talk about blood pressure in that way. We don't say, that's just a number. People just have to suck it up and deal with it. We recognize that if your blood pressure is high, that puts you at serious risk for a stroke and for other conditions. This is actually an important warning sign as well. And part of, I think, what we need to help people understand is what the data tells us, which is that the reality is that loneliness is similar to hunger or thirst in terms of a signal that our body sends us, a natural signal, when we lack something we need for survival, and that's social connection. And the keys there are that social connection is, in fact, that fundamental, something we need for survival. It's a necessary to have, not a nice to have. But it's also true that it's a warning sign, and it's something that can be addressed. So loneliness is not something we have to consign ourselves to as a society and say, well, this is just the way it is. It is something we can actually address and do something about. What has been inspiring to me actually has been to see communities starting to step up and build interventions in their own lives, in their neighborhoods, and sometimes a broader scale to actually address loneliness and isolation. When I came to the UK in 2018, I remember spending some time at one of the men's sheds near London that had really done a remarkable job in terms of bringing older men together to form community, inspired by the model that was started in Australia. And but like that, there are a number of other programs. In Chicago, here in the United States, there's a wonderful program called Becoming a Man, which is a program for young men in high school that actually brings them together to build relationships of trust with other young men in small groups of around 10, with a mentor and a facilitator who helps them with their discussions. And what has been extraordinarily powerful is to see how the social connections and trust built there have been powerful. And I don't just mean that in a sort of a general sense. I mean that in terms of hard numbers. When that program was examined and studied by the University of Chicago Crime Lab, what they found, in fact, is that the schools that actually had that program in place to help connect young people and help them find community had a 50% reduction in the rate of violent arrests compared to schools that did not have the Becoming a Man program. And they now have a similar program for young women called the WOW program, Working on Womanhood. So my point is that there are all kinds of interesting programs that are cropping up. I think our challenge as community members, as leaders in our own spheres, is to figure out how to make this part of a broader movement that can scale more quickly, where people can learn from each other about what's working and what's not working, where researchers and academics can pair up with communities to study interventions and more quickly understand which ones are having the greatest effect and which ones should be invested in and scaled up further. And so this requires a real partnership between communities and policymakers and academics. But I'm encouraged by what we're seeing. I think if you had told me 10 years ago, Kim, that you and I would be sitting here having a conversation about loneliness, as an issue of international concern, I might have been skeptical, but I've been educated by people all across America and the world who have helped me see, again, this is not something we struggle with alone, but this is something that we've collectively experienced that we have to address collectively.
Absolutely. Yeah, totally agree. That's one of the things I feel passionately about, is taking this holistic approach. And you touched on it many times there. So this is about physical health, it's about mental health, it's about social health, it's about all those things together. Coming together, and until we do that within our communities, and also from a policy perspective, we're never really going to see the change that I think we need to see. I'm working on a piece of work at the moment within the Labour Party around looking at that, how we do that in our policy making, and how it should be embedded into all the different government departments, so that we're looking well-being at the heart of policy making, and in that holistic way. And you're right to quote men's sheds. There's some amazing examples of work that's been done around the world, whether it's chatty cafes or knit and natter groups, men's sheds, or intergenerational work like the Cares family does. We've got wonderful Sharon from my neck of the woods on the call, who does a letter writing campaign called Give a Few Words. There's so many different initiatives now that are going on that are just absolutely heartwarming to see. And I'm going to go slightly off script, if I may, as I sometimes do, Vivek, and just say a bit of conversation in the chat taking place. And this is something I find an interesting conversation as well. Should we, in your view, be talking about addressing loneliness, tackling loneliness, or should we not be using that terminology? Should we be talking about human connection and social connection? Because I can see both sides to this. I think we shouldn't be afraid to talk about loneliness and address it for what it is. But I also think sometimes, certainly in the experience I've had, there are opportunities and occasions where it's better to do sort of loneliness by stealth. So we kind of do through, and I always defer to sport because that's my background. So let's get people walking together, or let's get people, playing a sport together. And then, we might be addressing loneliness, but we're doing it more stealthily, or often going towards the eating cake together, which is always a good thing as far as I'm concerned. So what's your view? Should we have a direct approach, or should we have a more stealthy approach?
It's such a good question, Kim, and you're such a gifted communicator, and I know that from other things I've seen you speak at. And so I think you're asking the right question, which is, how do we communicate in a way that people can receive the information appropriately? And that's where I think it does depend on your audience. It's not to say that one needs to hide any of these terms, but when approaching college students, for example, you might find it's easier to talk about social health, and to talk about, as people were talking about in the last panel, and to approach this from the standpoint of of improving our social connection as an important form of resiliency and strength, for our work on, our life on campus. So you might find that to be an important initiative, because I do think it's important for people to be able to look at some of these issues from a positive frame. There is enough that people feel weighed down with in the world that sometimes you add one more thing to the list and they just feel, oh my gosh, and they tune out. So I do think being able to frame this in a positive way is important. But with that said, I don't think we should shy away from talking about loneliness. I think particularly with policymakers, with the scientific community, with the healthcare community, it's important that people recognize that this is an actual issue of concern, one that we should look out to, that's linked to not only to adverse health outcomes that we care about, but we also know when people struggle with loneliness, it impacts how our kids perform in school. It impacts how people perform in the workplace. Some interesting work that had come from Sigal Barsade at Wharton showing that when people struggle with loneliness, in fact, impacts their creativity in the workplace. And we've also seen that there are potential impacts on retention as well as on productivity. So the bottom line is a factor that has such a broad impact on how people show up and function in society. I think it's important for us to frame it that way clearly for policymakers and for healthcare folks and for researchers as well. So, I think it's a bit nuanced, but I think I would approach it, I personally take that approach based on the audience, and figuring out what would be most compelling and useful for people to actually take action, on this issue. So one other thing I would just say, Kim, if I can, and I love going off script, so feel free to go as off script as you want. So this is great. I find it important and interesting to think about the concept of social infrastructure. We're used to thinking about regular infrastructure, bridges that we build, roads that we pave. But in my mind, part of what we have to do to address the loneliness crisis and rebuild social connection in the world is we have to reinvest in social infrastructure. And, so one question is, well, what is social infrastructure? Well, I think of social infrastructure really as the sort of as the combination of policies and programs and structures, like in a community, that actually facilitate the development of healthy relationships. Now, this could include everything from how we lay out our cities to the usability and reach of public transportation, how we design housing and green spaces, but it can also include the community programs like Men's Sheds, for example. It can include the role that faith organizations and others choose to take in bringing people together, especially bringing people together across differences. And so I think, I would think about the healthcare system as part of this as well. The UK has certainly been a pioneer in looking at the role that the healthcare system can play in connecting people who struggle with loneliness to community resources that can address loneliness. All of this, I think, is part of the social infrastructure that we've got to invest in and rebuild, and recognize that that foundation is just as important as the roads and bridges that we build. In addition to social infrastructure, though, I think that there are two other areas we need to focus on. I think one is technology, which you could think of in some ways as a part of infrastructure, but I call it out separately and differently here because I think technology has had such a profound impact on our lives, often in many good ways, and we don't want to give up technology, and move back to, 40, 50, 60 years ago before we had the ability to email or before we had the ability to call someone halfway across the world from a mobile phone. But what we do want to do is understand where technology may be having unintended consequences for us. And when I look at technology, in particular social media, and how it has affected people's relationships with one another, I find that often it has not been positive for many people. Yes, some people find community, some people are able to stay in touch with friends and build stronger relationships through social media. But I find many people, especially young people, their experience of social media is actually overall quite different and leads them, as they so often tell me when I do roundtables with young people around our country, they tell me three things consistently. One is it makes them feel worse about themselves. Two, that it makes them feel worse about their friendships. And third, they can't get off of it because these platforms are designed in many ways to keep us on, to maximize the amount of time spent. So I do think that what we need to do is design technology that creates healthy dialogue, that allows people to build healthy relationships. It should be about the quality of relationships, not the quantity of relationships. But finally, I think the third area we've got to work on is individual action. I think you are so right that in building social infrastructure, we've got to focus on policy. And I love what you said, which is to think about a connection in all policies approach, to be recognizing that everything from transportation to housing to education policy, in addition to health policy, have an impact on connection. I also think as a complement to that, individual action is so important. We have to, think about the decisions that we make, like in our everyday lives. The decision about how to prioritize people. Do we make time for people in our lives? Do we actually show up to our conversations with authenticity and with our full attention? How do we approach one another? Is it with grace and forgiveness? And also, do we reach out to people who have other different perspectives to listen and to learn and to understand? And do we help people in their moment of need, recognizing that service to other people is one of the greatest antidotes to loneliness and disconnection? These are individual actions that we can take, that we can cultivate in our families. And that combination of individual action, community action, and policy action is what we need to ultimately build a more connected world.
Absolutely spot on. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. The only way that we're going to address so many issues in society, I believe, is it's got to be top down and bottom up. We've got to do the policy making stuff up here, but also it's looking at what that community piece looks like. And as you say, individually, what are we doing? And, we're probably, many of us on this call are guilty of rushing around from one thing to the next without actually being in the moment and actually really valuing the conversation that we're having. And I can be as bad at that as anybody else can. So it's thinking about our individual role in, oh, are you all right? Well, just ask again, are you really all right? Just taking those extra little moments in the day to check in on people. And I think the social infrastructure concept, absolutely. What kind of societies are we building that give us opportunities for human connection and to look out for each other and to make sure that human beings are at the center of our world rather than our devices and our phones and all the rest of it. And I agree with you. For me, technology, social media in particular, is a double-edged sword. It's enabled us to do things like today, which is wonderful. But unfortunately, particularly as you say, for young people, it creates a world which isn't necessarily reflective of the real world, and there's all sorts of problems associated with that. So I think, and I think the political side of this is this cross-departmental approach to addressing social infrastructure. I think also for me, I'm really keen that it's a cross-sector approach. The voluntary sector do amazing work on loneliness and human connection, but we can't leave all the heavy lifting to them. Partly because we don't fund them properly, so that's a big part of it. And all the charities that I've worked with in the past few years, they're carrying the weight on this. So we've got to look at what the private sector can do. Was interestingly in Parliament last week, the Red Cross launched their latest report, which is about loneliness in the workplace. And I'm really glad that those conversations are taking place. So what can employers do to tackle loneliness in their staff? Because a happy, healthy, well-connected workforce is a productive workforce. So there are economic benefits to addressing these issues as well. So I think that holistic approach is really, really important. And again, going back to the first point about whether we tackle loneliness head on or not, I think you're right. I think it probably just depends on the audience. It depends on the circumstances. I mean, probably no one wants to be in a situation where they go, right, all the lonely people come and stand over there.
Exactly.
That's probably not the right strategy. So I think being sensitive, that is really important as well. So I think we're nearly out of time, which I'm really sad about. But what are the things that you would like to see change? If we think about looking forward now, what are the biggest changes you think we can be making as individuals and as a society?
Yeah, it's such a good question, Kim, and I could talk to you forever. I always enjoy this time. And, I'll tell you this, in terms of what we need to do, they're the sort of tactical steps that we need to take to, as mentioning, like build social infrastructure, create healthy technology for us, and take individual actions in our day-to-day lives. But I think there's something bigger than that and more fundamental than that we have to focus on as well, which is to recognize that what we are fundamentally trying to do is not only change policy and build programs, but there's something culturally that we are trying to change as well. And I think of it as actually very much based in values. And when I talk to people, around the country and around the world, many people tell me that they're worried that the world feels meaner now, that somehow it feels that people care less about one another, that it doesn't really feel like we're all in it together. It feels like we're all in it for ourselves. Like, this is sort of the feeling I hear from people who are older, people who are younger, people who don't want it to be like that, but are concerned about what they see and hear on the airwaves. I don't think that that's fundamentally who we are. And I think this is a time where we have to ignite a moral reawakening in the world, and a movement that helps us refocus on the values of kindness and generosity and service and love. These are not values that make us weak. These are values that make us strong. And they have to inform the actions we take in our day-to-day lives, as well as the policies that we formulate, the leaders that we put forward to guide us, and the institutions that we build. They have to be grounded in these core values. Without our values, we are lost. And this is a moment for us to ask, what values do we want to guide us? What do we want to recenter on? And how can we make sure that the people who represent us reflect those values at the highest level? We have experienced over recent years, accelerated in part by COVID, but even preceding that, a social recession in many parts of the world, where our connections with each other have shrunk. This is a time for us to create a social revival in the world and to bring people together once again. And every generation, I believe, we are called to look at the world with fresh eyes and to ask, how can we make it better? And this is the time for a new generation of people who I think of as social revivalists, who can recognize the core values that we need to recenter our lives and society around, and who can make sure that those values are in fact reflected in our day-to-day actions and in our policies and institutions. And that's actually the movement I believe that we're called to build. This is nothing. What we're talking about here is no less important than ensuring the future is secure, safe, and good for our kids. Right? I think about my own children who are 5 and 6. They're my greatest source of joy. They teach me new things all the time. They keep me honest. They remind me to be humble. They're just extraordinary human beings. But what I think about most with my children is the kind of world that they're going to inherit. And I do worry, right? There are a lot of challenges that we're facing, whether it's climate change, whether it's inequality, whether it's economic stresses and challenges, or pandemics, like what we just went through. But what I worry about most is whether the world will be hospitable for my children and for all of our children. Will there be somebody to help my child up when they stumble and fall down, as they inevitably will? Will my child know that the most important thing for them to do is to help someone else up when they fall down, and to be loving and kind? Will we define strength not as how much money, power, and fame you have, but as your willingness to be able to serve and to give and receive love and to be kind? How are we going to define and reflect values, now and for the coming generation? That's what will define the future for our children. And so that's why I'm so glad to be here with all of you, because I know the people on this call recognize how important it is for us to rebuild social connection in the world, and how I recognize that that's the bedrock of society. But to me, this is so much bigger than one single health issue, as part of a larger list of issues. This is a fundamental, foundational issue. This is about a moral reawakening in America and in the world, and reflecting that really in our connections with one another.
Wow, that is just amazing. And as someone has just put in the chat, absolutely inspirational. And I can't really add much to that, because I just think you've absolutely nailed it. We need to look at what matters in our lives, and we need to look at what matters in society. And I think you're right. I think going back to the core values of what it means to be a good human being and to be part of a good, healthy, vibrant society, and the values that we have are at the core of that. I know people sometimes sort of say to me, well, you're in politics now and that's a different world. And it is a different world. And I've got to keep thinking, well, what are my values? Why am I in this job that I'm in now? And I always come back to that I'm people-centered. Everything I do is about people, and my ideas are values-driven. And I know, and that's the advantage, I suppose, of coming into politics when you're a little bit older. I know what my values are. I know what matters to me. But you've just got to keep them at the forefront of your mind every day, and not get dragged down to the negativity and the division, which, as you rightly said, we unfortunately see. But I think it's absolutely right to end on a really positive note. We've got 157 people on this call who are all part of the solution to some of the problems that we know that we've got. And certainly for me, Vivek, having listened to you today, I am going to go away with renewed energy and vigor to tackle some of those problems and be part of the solution, and think really carefully about what I can do to make sure that human connection is at the heart of my work and everything that I do. I can't thank you enough for your time. Hugely inspirational. And I really do hope we can get together in person sometime soon.
I hope so too. I thank you for having this conversation. I loved it. I really enjoyed it. And I'll finally just say, as somebody who was born in Huddersfield and in West Yorkshire, I feel a sense of pride seeing you in Parliament. So wonderful to be with you, Kim.